All right, so last week I did two things that I want to cover quickly and not spend a whole lot of time on. And my proclivity is to re-preach everything that I said last week, but I really don't want to do that. But the two things that I did last week was we talked about the various views on Matthew 24, and then we talked about the preterist view, because what I wanted to do was I wanted to give you the best foot forward on preterism in order to so I can be faithful to the view of preterism. And then I'll show you today why that view at least is not true in its entirety. There are elements of preterism that are true, but there are certainly some flaws in the preterist position. But real quickly, and they might not be the flaws that you think that they are, but for the two of you who were here last week, because I asked this question, because I had the same response when I first heard of preterism, that what Jesus was talking about was AD 70. I thought that was just off the hook crazy. That's just nonsense. Now, of course, I don't want to persuade you of it because I don't believe the system, but how many of you now, though, can see why people would believe that system?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's not that strange once you look at
Orthodox,
it.
but
not unorthodox, but orthodox preterism. So let's go through the major views real quickly, and then we will talk about those major views. So what was the first view?
Futurism.
And the most popular?
Futurism.
Okay.
Things to come.
7-year period. Great.
Okay, and then how many futuristic views are there?
There
Three.
Three. So the most popular one is what?
Dispensational.
Dispensational, and then there are different categories under that. We'll skip all those, but they
None.
all have to do with pre-trib, mid-trib, dual,
Post-trib.
triple trib,
Yeah.
post-trib, post, and pre-wrath.
Pre-wrath.
Okay, so there's like 5 or 6 views on this view.
Babies in the balloon.
Yes. And then what's
non-dispensational.
okay? So these are not, both of these are non-dispensational, but the first one would be the first one we
Historical.
talked about would be historical. We put that down here. What did I call it last time? Non-dispensational.
Pre-wrath.
Oh wait, how did I put that?
Actually,
did I
You
divide
put,
it?
it as,
Yeah.
you put it as dispensational of A and B was.
Oh, gotcha.
non.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Yeah.
sorry. So
This
B.
is A and B.
So
Just A
B
and
was
B.
non-disp,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
and then
the cults and the
and
orthodox.
then 1 and 2
Cults and unorthodox and cults and orthodox.
orthodox. Okay, so the cults would be like Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witness. They all believe that this portion of Scripture is talking about the future, but their big deal is it all happens within their system. You know, the Mormons, it all happens within the Mormon system, and the Jehovah's Witness, it all happens in the Jehovah's Witness system. And then the Orthodox futurists are people like, well, my friend who recently passed away, Robert Morey, was an Orthodox futurist when it came to this. And they just simply believe that this is about the future, that there's no 7-year tribulation in which they're trying to decide when this is going to happen, but this is just a future event. That Matthew 24 is describing a future time, future to the apostles and future to us, still future to us. Okay, so you can call it the Great Tribulation or just a future time of the Antichrist, whatever you want to call it, but still future. Then the other view was,
Preterist.
okay,
Things gone by.
and then the A and then
A and B.
Things
A
to
and
come,
B.
Things to
A
come.
was orthodox.
Things to come. Dwight Pentecost.
Well, instead of things to come, things gone by.
Things gone by.
Days gone by.
Orthodox and then unorthodox. And Orthodox believe that everything, at least everything up to what verse is in the past?
24:36.
Okay, it's now understand that they do still believe this is prophecy. It was prophecy when Jesus spoke it, but it's fulfilled prophecy now, and that everything that's happening here in Matthew chapter 24 up to verse 36 happened in AD 70. Okay, that's the idea. Everything after is still future. But it's spotty. Some are, some aren't. It just depends on the preterist. Does that make sense? Did you have, so when he says,
That would have been Bonson.
yes, most of your major preterists says that heaven and earth will pass away. In verse 34 it says, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, my words will not pass away. But concerning that day, no one knows. So they divide the days. They say this day, everything here is happening to that generation. Everything this way is forward. So the rest of the chapter is forward. Unorthodox preterism believes what?
All of
It's all
it has
changed.
already happened, and
All
there is
fulfilled.
no return.
There's
of
no
Christ.
return of Christ. And they call it unorthodox because it's not orthodox. It's a heresy. And then we had two views over here. And then I just miscellaneous. And-
Dual fulfillment?
And I put 1 and 2 because they're not subsets of each other. There's a handful of views out there that can't fit into any category. And it's just a matter of who you're reading, when you're reading it, whoever it is, or whoever you're listening to. However, there's two that are most prominent, and that is what's the first one?
Dual fulfillment.
Dual fulfillment.
Those are the people who cannot believe in a preterist orthodox view.
Well, what happens normally in a dual fulfillment is they'll say, well, this, because the language and because the arguments are so strong about it being a preterist position, but they're so tied to the fact that this has to be future that they say, well, it must be a dual fulfillment. You must have a fulfillment here and a fulfillment sometime in the future. Okay, so that's the dual fulfillment theory. And that's just because their arguments get devastated, but they just can't think of that this is not about the future, because they were just raised their whole life being told this is the future, this is the future, this is the future. Who's a dual fulfillment? I don't know of anybody who has written a book on it, but I know like lots of individuals who say, so for instance, when Oasis was here, the Oasis Church, the pastor of that church was a dual fulfillment. He thought, well, it has to be dual. Oh yeah, he'd say you're right. All this stuff is, but it's also about the future too.
Greg Wright.
Greg Wright.
I've heard him say was an immediate fulfillment, and then far away there's the final fulfillment.
Mm-hmm. And then the other one is the one that I'm going to kind of argue for tonight, and that is the
Church age. theory.
church age. And then with this, what's happening here up to verse 35, I'm going to say that there's a special emphasis placed on the apostles and what they were going to face during that day. Okay, not a total emphasis, but a special emphasis placed on them and what they are going to do. Now, last week I took you through the preterist arguments as to why this is about the destruction of Jerusalem, or the destruction of the temple in particular, and the destruction of Jerusalem in general, and their time text, which says this generation, and how that has always meant this generation. There's nowhere in the Bible that said that, particularly in Matthew, where it says this generation, it doesn't mean that generation that he's talking to. So that's not going to be your wiggle room out of it. This generation means this generation, okay? The other part is the backdrop of this, and that is that he pronounces destruction on that generation when he comes out of the temple. He says to the Pharisees, your house is left to you desolate, and all the blood of righteous Abel to Zechariah will come upon this generation. And so now look here, look at chapter 23 again here, and we'll recap this real quickly. In verse 34, it says, therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, these things will come upon this generation. And that generation did crucify people and put them to death and all that stuff that they did. And then he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often I would have gathered your children as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, yet you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So he pronounces judgment on their house. He says, this generation is going to see it. Your house is left to you desolate. And then in chapter 24 and verse 1, he says, Jesus left the temple and was going away, and his disciples came to him and pointed out to him the building of the temple. So they're pointing, they get what he's saying. Your house is left to you desolate. They know that he's drawing upon the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. But he answered, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone left upon another that will not be torn or thrown down." Now this obviously can't be a future temple, because he says not one stone here will be left upon another. So this is obviously the temple he's talking about, is this temple. So they're confused again, and they come up now. What this chapter is about and what the rest of Matthew 24 and 25 is about has to be understood in light of the questions they ask. They ask 3 questions, but in their mind they are grouping these questions together into one event. Okay, any answer that Jesus gives that doesn't address these, I would just say, is an answer based, that if you think that's an answer, that's based on a preconceived idea of what you want the future to be like, of what you want your eschatology to be, and not based on this. I mean, obviously, if I say, hey, when's this going to happen? What will be the signs? And then I record that, you go off onto something. I mean, it's just a little too much big of a hurdle for me to jump over. Does that make sense? So what do they ask? This is going to come down to this view over here, okay? What I believe is happening here. Okay?
When will these things be?
So they came to him privately and they said, "Tell us, when will these things be?" Now these things are obviously a reference to what he just said. Okay, there can't be a difference between these things. Now keep that phrase in your mind, these things, and what Jesus just said. Jesus just predicted the end of the temple.
They heard him speaking.
Yeah, they heard it. Yeah, of course.
And they pulled him aside and said, "Hey, when?"
Yeah, when? When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Okay, so let's look at those 3 things. And let's try to understand, not to force Christian clarity into these things. So now, they want to know these things, right? And I would say that is definitely, they're asking about what he just prophesied, the destruction of the temple. Now they ask 2 other questions, but they assume that it's part of the same thing. I mean, we have the same problem today. People think that people thought in the Old Testament, or not in the Old Testament, but and when the Rome fell, that was the end of the world. Okay, it wasn't. The world's gone on fine for another 1,500 years without Rome. People today tend to think that if America falls, well, that's it. It's the end of the world. Maybe, but maybe not. We could go on another 150, 200, 300 years without America, okay, as it is. So it's no small wonder that they thought that if Jerusalem got destroyed and the temple got destroyed, well, that would be the end of the world for them. So they asked 2 questions that are really kind of doublet answers, or doublet questions for them. And what are the 2 questions that they asked?
What will be the sign of your coming?
Okay, what will be the sign of your coming? and 2 and 3, the end of the age. Now these things get all jumbled together in their mind, and what Jesus does from this point is then string that. You have to unstring that, right? Let me warn you, what will be the sign of your coming is, this is not, they are not asking when Jesus will return. They didn't even know Jesus was going to die, yet be risen again from the dead. Okay? So when they say what will be the sign of your coming, that's more than likely a reference to the Messiah coming to his kingdom predicted in Daniel. When it says that the Ancient of Days will go to, or does it say the Son of Man will go to the Ancient of Days to receive a kingdom. And the end of the age. Now they did believe in the end of the world, because that's predicted in Daniel as well, where it talks about everybody coming from their tombs to get judged. So they believed this, but they're kind of mixing this together. Okay? But this right here has to be answered. Anything that says, well, I answer this and this, but I don't answer this, to me is not thinking straight. This is what they want to know. This is what they want to know. But like anytime, and we've all had this experience where if you're a teacher or something like that, people kind of ask questions and they mix things together. You know, you gotta, you know, somebody comes up to you and they say, oh, hey, what's this kick? Like, well, look, it's kind of like a front kick. It's kind of like a side kick. It's kind of like, look, this is a front kick. You know what I mean? You have to go, look, this is what you're doing here. This part's a front kick. This part's a side kick. What you did is a mess, right? So you have to kind of unstring this. Now, this is what Jesus is doing. He's unstringing this mess in their head, because the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple is not the end of the world. But he has to answer these things as well. So how does he do it? Okay. Well, a good sign in which you can kind of tell where things break apart in their literary structure is what's called inclusio. Now, we said what inclusio was before. What is inclusio? Does anybody remember?
No.
It's a literary device. It's a literary device. Okay, where what happens in this literary device?
Isn't it like bookends?
Yeah,
Yes.
they're bookends where something's mentioned, and then you have a string of things mentioned, and something's mentioned again. The same thing on each end, and it kind of brings these things together. So now, look at the bookends I want you to see here. The bookends are in verse 4. It says, Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will lead many astray. Okay? So this time period that Jesus is talking about is marked out by people claiming to be the Messiah. Now, that term Christ right there, yes, we understand Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah, but in its more broader application simply means anybody who has a special insight with God. Anybody who's specially anointed by God.
False prophets.
Anybody who says, I'm on the inside track is somebody who's specially anointed for God. So I don't think, yes, you do have the occasional person who says, I'm Jesus Christ, but I don't think that's limited to this language. It just means anybody who says, I'm specially set apart for God. Okay, so now look at verse 23. It says, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and perform great signs and wonders, so to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See that I have told you beforehand, so that if they say to you, look, here he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So this time is marked out by false prophets and false messiahs. So now we've got real good bookends here. The first bookend is this false Christ, and the second bookend is false Christs as well. Okay? And then we've got everything in between. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. But notice what he says here in verse 29. And this is one of the reasons, I'm going to give you one of the answers as to why I am not a preterist. Okay, look at verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven. Now, look at verse 27 first. For as lightning comes from east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. When the Son of Man comes, there will be no question as to his identity. Okay, so he's saying, this is how you're going to know. Don't follow anybody who says I'm a false Christ or a false prophet. He's going to put an end to that by his return. Okay, he's going to put an end to that by his second coming. There will be no question when he comes. There will be no question at all. Okay, so then it says immediately after the tribulation